The Colombian rebel group, the Farc, free the last remaining police officers and soldiers who were held hostage. We ask if this could be the beginning of the end of Latin America's longest-running insurgency, or will the Farc simply use this as an opportunity to strengthen its forces? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Ratansi. The Farc rebel group in Colombia is calling it a gesture of peace, freeing the last 10 members of the armed forces and police they were holding hostage. They'd been held captive for more than a decade in the jungle. The Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, also known as the Farc, has been involved in an armed insurgency against the government for 5 decades. The left-wing group says it represents the rural poor in a struggle against Colombia's wealthier classes and opposes the United States' influence in Colombia. Thousands have been kidnapped for ransom. But in recent years, several of Farc's leaders have been killed, and the fighters have been driven back into ever more remote regions as Colombian forces, backed by US military aid, mounted an offensive. The release of the 10 hostages and an announcement in February that the group will no longer take hostages for ransom could signal that the Farc is now ready for a negotiated settlement of its struggle. But skeptics argue peace talks may merely be a ruse for the Farc to regroup and strengthen after those recent losses. President Santos is demanding that Farc free all its remaining prisoners and cease attacks on civilian and military targets before any talks take place. Recent weeks have seen an intensification of fighting between the government and the rebels, and it's difficult to determine how many civilians are still held captive by the Farc. Gabriel Elizondo now has been following events. He has this report from Villavicencio, where the 10 hostages were returned on Monday.
Finally, freedom. Exhausted and relieved, 10 men held hostage in the jungles of Colombia, free in a humanitarian handover. Some had spent 14 years in captivity, but no more. This was their first moment of freedom. This operation was not led by the Colombian government. It was brokered by the International Committee for the Red Cross and also Colombians for Peace, an organization long critical of the government's refusal to engage in peace talks with the Farc. Apparently wanting to downplay the outsiders' role in the hostage release, the Colombian government barred family members from greeting their loved ones on the tarmac, and unlike previous hostage homecomings, prevented the media from filming the emotional first encounters with family. That led to some frustration as the day went along.
I'm trying to get through to the president because I want to see my dad. I was only 4 years old when he was captured, and all I want to do is see him when he gets off the helicopter, but I can't.
After a 2-hour delay because of rain, a Brazilian Air Force helicopter finally took off in what would turn out to be a 7-hour journey to pick up the hostages and bring them back to safety. At a press conference late Monday, Colombians for Peace said the hostages arrived at the drop-off point in the jungle on a boat singing a song. They sang part of it. "We are almost there. I cannot avoid my eyes tearing up," the lyrics say. After a very long day, it's clear that this operation went better than anybody could have expected, with all of the hostages being released. But now the question that many in this country are going to be asking themselves is, will this release lead to new peace talks between the Farc and the Colombian government?
So, will this latest hostage release lead to eventual peace talks and perhaps a negotiated settlement with the Colombian government? Joining us to discuss this is Jim Jones, a development specialist who's worked in areas under Farc control and who's had contact with Farc several times. In Bogota, we're joined by Bernardo Perez Salazar. He's a researcher of Colombia's armed conflict and peace process. He's also had first-hand experience of dealing with Farc members over the management of natural resources. Also in the studio, we have Marc, the author of a book entitled The Farc at the Negotiating Table. He's a professor of Latin American Studies at Georgetown University. Bernardo Perez Salazar, then, the government is playing down this latest release, but do you think this might lead to substantive talks?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer. The government is in the middle of its 4-year period, so the government is thinking in the elections in the next 2 years. And peace processes here in Colombia have been very messy. So I don't think that the president will want to undergo any peace process before he is re-elected, if he is re-elected. But I think that's his calculation, and that's why he's playing down with the releases this week. I think he wants to be very cautious. I think he doesn't want to have a peace process in his first period of government.
And this is, in fact, what President Santos did have to say after the releases.
This liberation is part of a promise by Farc to no longer kidnap. It's a step in the right direction, a very important step. But like we said when they made the initial announcement, I hope that more will be done. This promise is not sufficient. They have to free the kidnapped civilians that are still in their power. The country, the world in general, reclaims the liberty of all of the kidnapped.
And on that issue of kidnapped civilians, it's difficult to really get a firm idea of the numbers, but as far as the recent history of kidnapping, in the year 2000, more than 2,100 people were kidnapped in total. It's difficult to say how many of those were taken by Farc as opposed to other groups. In 2002, Farc alone is said to have taken over 930 hostages. Over the past decade, the number of kidnappings dropped significantly. By 2010, it took just 64 hostages, and the number of actual civilian hostages, I mean, actually authorities in Colombia suggests may just be a handful, perhaps of 6 or 7, or including some Chinese oil workers. Professor, is that then, what is the government goal right now? Clearly then, perhaps mindful of past failure, President Santos isn't keen to get fully involved in the peace process. So is it really more about disruption, if not defeat, at least in the short term as far as the Farc is concerned?
No, I think President Santos understands that there isn't a military solution to this conflict, that ultimately this will end at the negotiating table. But I agree with Bernardo. He's being very cautious. He's very mindful for re-election, and he wants to keep firm control. But he's opened up a space. He's said repeatedly, I have the key to peace in my pocket, and when it's ready, I will use it. The Farc, from their side, have said repeatedly, and with this gesture of releasing the final military and police hostages, they're saying, we want to negotiate. And there's great clamor from the victims and from civil society to move this forward. I don't know if we can wait 2 years. The conflict continues. There isn't going to be a military end. And so this is the dilemma of President Santos. Does he open up this space? How does he open up the space? How does he open up the space and not lose control as past presidents have done? That's his dilemma. And so he's going to move forward, but he's going to be very cautious. For some of us, it's agonizing how slow he is. But the movement is inexorably forward towards a negotiated settlement.
All right, so if we are looking then at some kind of resolution at last of this conflict, Jim Jones, then we do have to look at the origins of the Farc and what it is they want. Is it oversimplifying things to suggest, well, you know, Colombia almost since independence in 1819 has been beset by several civil conflicts, and this is just the latest in a long line of those conflicts that have killed so many for pretty much the same sort of reasons, or is it distinct? I mean, does it just take its place in the historical chain of conflict in Colombia?
Well, I think the current conflict in its current phase is certainly an extension of conflict in Colombia historically. And the Farc started out as a peasant insurgency. Okay, they were founded by peasants, small farmers. Peasants are small farmers, and much of that beginning is still with them. Much of that agenda that's important to them is still there, and probably central to that is the whole notion of rural development, agrarian reform. That has long been the centerpiece of the Farc, and I think it is still very, very present. I mean, the guerrillas, okay, out there who are fighting the conflict with the Farc are almost overwhelmingly from peasant families.
So, Professor, then, I mean, were there specific conditions that led to the Farc taking arms? And in fact, in some ways, do those conditions still exist? I mean, after all these years,
no, absolutely. If you look at the leaders of the Farc, Jim's got it absolutely right, and it's unusual for insurgencies anywhere in the world. Usually you have intellectuals organizing peasants. Here we have peasants taking up arms. In fact, the leadership took up arms not as the Farc, but as liberal guerrillas. That is part of an earlier conflict between the two oligarchical parties, liberal conservative. But when the two parties made peace, a group of liberal guerrillas and also communist guerrillas stayed outside. And they've made demands for agrarian reform, for equitable development in the countryside. If anything, particularly in the last 20 years, the conditions in rural Colombia are worse. Land is more concentrated. There has been about 5 million peasants displaced from their homes. And so the issues that led to the Farc taking up arms, in many ways and objective criteria, are worse.
Bernardo Perez Salazar, I mean, you've had very close contact with the Farc leadership, as I think all of you have in some ways. But what does that mean specifically when, in previous decades, the Farc leadership has sat around a table with the government? I mean, we hear terms like agrarian reform and justice and equity and so forth, but what specifically does that mean once they're around the table and they're saying, all right, let's hammer out some kind of settlement?
Well, I think that peace processes here in Colombia have been very messy issues, as I mentioned in my first intervention. Because of the fact that they have usually been improvised, they've been flashes of political creativity, and somebody thinks that they will benefit from a peace process, and so then the Farc will open themselves to exploring what type of agenda can be discussed. But I think that one of the main problems with peace processes with Farc is the fact that even though they do have a very agrarian agenda, the political leadership of the country does not have a clear idea of what is it that they are going to negotiate, not only with Farc but with the rest of the country. Because what I find is that what we're discussing, even though this has never been explicitly laid on the table, is what type of state do we want? Do we want an impartial, liberal state that stands aside while mining companies will mine the countryside and displace people? Or do we have a more Republican, in the classical sense, a state that will defend the weaker and will push for income distribution? I think that that's the type of discussions that
Let me pick up on something that Bernardo said. I think, one of the problems in Colombia, and it's a huge problem, is that the political establishment, for the most part, with few exceptions, does not have a good understanding of realities in the remoter rural areas of the country. It has never had them. And Colombia is a country by the measure of the so-called Gini coefficient, which is a measure of income distribution. Colombia, I think, according to the 2011 statistics, is the third most unequal country in the world. And land concentration in Colombia is it's huge. I mean, something like 1% of the population owns, I think, 60% of the land. Statistics vary on this. Okay, so many of these conditions that gave rise to the Farc are still very much present.
And that's what's so interesting about previous initiatives, like the original Plan Colombia under President Pastrana. There seemed to be some recognition of the underpinnings of the conflict, that there had to be some sort of Marshall Plan perhaps for the agrarian sector or the agrarian communities and so forth. And yet somehow that was hijacked into sort of 80% military aid, 20% perhaps development aid, if that. If in the 80s and 90s they had gone, if the Pastrana version of Plan Colombia, or the original Pastrana version of Plan Colombia had gone into effect, Professor, do you think we might not still be in this position, or is that too utopian?
Well, that's pretty interesting. President Pastrana came to office talking about a Marshall Plan for the coca growing areas, working with the Farc to address the issue of coca crops. Coca is the crop used to make cocaine, and providing alternative alternative crops. When that made it to the United States and made it to the Clinton administration and Congress, they turned that around, just as you mentioned. Yes, if the original Plan Colombia had focused on that, there would have been great progress. But the point that Bernardo made is quite important. There was not unanimity, consensus among political and economic elites. Pastrana opened up an idea of talks, he raised ideas, but he didn't have support among the political parties, he didn't have support among certainly the economic and business interests, and certainly not among the large landowners and corporations. Right. What needs to be done now is a discussion not just with the Farc, but with all of society, and it also has to be placed on the table. There are multiple armed actors in Colombia. There's the guerrilla, but there's also the paramilitaries. Right. And if you just negotiate with the guerrillas and you don't have a plan that comprehensively addresses other factors of violence, we're not going to go forward.
Bernardo, that sounds a bit concerning though, because if anything, the forces of neoliberal corporate structures and so forth, that those who are looking to extract Colombia's resources, the oligarchs who control business and so forth, have, if anything, got even more powerful in the interim. Those issues seem even less likely to be sorted out right now. Doesn't that make things even more precarious? I mean, this idea that the FARC and the government then can simply sit around a table and hammer this out seems even more remote then, doesn't it?
Let me pick up on...
Bernardo, and I don't,
go ahead, Bernardo.
Yes, I don't think that peace will be found at a table where government and FARC are the only ones who are sitting at the table. I think that FARC have realized that they no longer, or they have never really, represented a large proportion of the population. They have a rural agenda in a predominantly urban country. Their worries are very different from the worries of the urban poor. They have kept very distant from the population because they have been a self-contained military outfit. So I think that one of the things that is changing now in the political landscape of FARC is that they're beginning to understand that they have no future in their strictly following their strategic plan of taking over the government and ending the conflict by ending class conflict, which is what the military usually, how they characterize what the FARC are offering. So I think that you will find that the peace process here in Colombia will be a very complex process because it will have to call on very different actors and sectors. You'll have to call on the indigenous peoples, you have to call on the urban poor, you'll have to call on the blacks, you'll have to call poor peasants. There's a lot of, and you'll have to call on the large middle urban class that is very distant from the FARC agenda at present.
As far as the FARC agenda is concerned, we thought it might be useful just to quickly summarize how, or the strength of the FARC right now. That precise figures have always been difficult to come by, but the Colombian government estimated that at its height in 2001, FARC had around 17,000 fighters and controlled almost a third of the country. But with those increasing attacks by government forces, thousands of fighters have deserted the rebels, and estimates now put current FARC strength at about 8,000 or 9,000. Jim Jones, you've been in contact with the FARC leadership. Was there ever a sense that they did think armed struggle would succeed? What did they make of other armed struggles around them in Latin America, their sort of dissipation? I mean, is that contributing perhaps, do you think, to how the FARC leadership see current events? Or does the general failure of global capitalism only strengthen their cause and they think, well, hang on, we are onto a viable alternative to all of this mess?
No, I don't think the FARC really focuses much on the experience of insurgents in other countries of the Americas. I remember once talking with the late Reyes, who was killed in a bombing raid about 5 years ago. Well, 5 years ago, and he pulled out a copy of Semana, in which the guerrilla head of in El Salvador, had come out and said that the FARC were basically losing the war. And Raúl looked at it and he laughed. He said, what does he know about the FARC? He's never been here. So I think they don't focus too much on that. The FARC is an insurgency that's focused overwhelmingly on Colombia. And the times that I have been with them, I mean, we hear it said that they're a Marxist-Leninist group. They may have started out like that, but I never saw, at least the icons, okay, in the camps that I visited, and I witnessed some of the training sessions, and all of the figures, with the exception of Che Guevara, okay, all of those figures were Colombians. Colombians who had been killed, for example, two presidential candidates who were part of a political party that the FARC created, and the right-wing interest assassinated something like 3,000 members of that party.
I mean, that's the point. I mean, there was that experiment with democratic politics when they set up the Patriotic Union in the 80s, and they were basically decimated as soon as they came out of the jungle by right-wing paramilitaries, apparently with government connivance. Does that shadow still fall then on any talk of this?
There's no question. For the FARC, that's front and center.
It's front and center.
The rest of the country has mostly forgotten about that experience, but not the FARC. No. And they're not going to come in without real guarantees. That's part of the agenda. And let me use that to address something that Bernardo said. Peace process will need to be comprehensive. We'll have to have multiple actors. It's not going to be just the government and the FARC. I agree with that. But peace goes through the FARC. There are those who think they can make peace without the FARC, build peace. But that can't happen either, because the main current of this war goes government FARC. That has to be part of it. But then you need to bring in the other representatives and voices of society and the other armed actors that are mostly in multinational corporations, state, landowners.
But those aren't necessarily in the open, though. I mean, isn't that part of the problem? Bernardo Perez Salazar, even President Santos, has talked about a dark hand in Colombian politics. Who controls that dark hand? Do they want peace? Does the U.S. necessarily want a sort of equitable solution to agrarian, urban relations and so forth, and the equitable distribution of wealth and so forth that you're talking about, that you say is key to getting peace in Colombia?
Well, I do think that everybody is ready for peace here in Colombia. Even FARC are ready for peace. I think that they've seen too much human suffering and too much waste, as the rest of the world. So I think that everybody is behind the peace process. I think the trouble here is that we haven't quite figured out how to get there. I think everybody wants peace, but since we are in a conflict, we can't agree on what that peace would be like. And I think that's a major point. The government and civil society, and they're asking FARC to surrender, and in a sense, they're asking for a negative peace, in the sense that once FARC no longer operates, then we'll have peace. And that's a lie. That's completely misrepresenting the situation. I think the government has to think the fact that the country needs something which we haven't had for the past 50 years, and we've forgotten what it's like. And it will need a lot of imagination to figure out what peace will be like.
We only have a minute left. I want a last word from our two guests in the studio, Professor Chernick, first of all.
Yes, well, let me say, there are enemies of peace. Not everyone wants peace. And this we see in peace processes all around the world. The academic term are spoilers. There are spoilers in Colombia. There are people who want to derail this process. They'll do everything they can to obstruct it. If they go forward, the Santos administration, if they want peace, the other forces that want peace have to be aware for it, and they can't be intimidated from the process of searching for peace and being around a negotiating table. And so if they take that into account, then they can go forward, but they also need international help. I'm not sure the United States is on board. I think the United States believes in much of this idea that peace building and counterinsurgency can move the process forward. Yeah. I'm not sure they're on board yet, but
despite their experiences in Afghanistan.
Exactly. But my hope is that they will follow the lead of President Santos if President Santos leads on this.
Jim Jones, 30 seconds.
Yes, I think there are many who think that peace lies on the other side of the battlefield. And the other side of that battlefield can be quite a ways off. And to get there is going to mean a lot of bloodshed. And I think the U.S. could be very, very helpful. I'm not sure that they're, as Marc said, I'm not sure they're on board. I tend to think they're not. I think they have favored a military solution to a conflict that does not really have a military solution, and that bothers me.
Jim Jones, thank you very much. Professor Marc Chernick, thank you. And in Bogota, Bernardo, Perez, Salazar, thank you very much. And that's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas directly to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net.